Manufacturing Advantage webinar. Our speaker today is John Koskinen, Chief Economist at the Wisconsin Department of Revenue. John has a ton of insight into what's happening in Wisconsin's economy, and he'll walk us through the latest trends in manufacturing and what they mean as we head into the new year. Please note that participant mics will be muted for the presentation, but we'll have time for a question and answer session at the end, so feel free to jot down any questions as we go. And with that, I'll hand it over to John.
All right, let me see if I can pull off the share here. Oh, great. Let's try that one. I have so many open. Preparing my slides. There we go. I assume, do you get a full screen even if I don't have it as a presenter?
Yeah, we can see the full screen.
Okay, so great. All right. Let's get right to it. The bottom line up front. As I was pulling all of this together, one of the things that I think is easily overlooked is sort of the top dot point that I have there is getting all of the wheat and chaff. The trend is rather substantial, and it's going to be amplified, I think, over the next year or two, is the United States is substantially rebuilding its manufacturing capacity, and we are totally partners in that. On the other side, in Wisconsin, the U.S. economy confronts the twin deficits, as I call it, the federal budget deficit, the international trade deficit. Anytime you solve big problems, you have big dislocations. The impact varies by region, industry, and I would say even within manufacturing. For us, as I said, we are rebuilding our manufacturing capacity, and more is in the pipeline. We've substantially improved our competitiveness, and we are in a solid position to outperform the U.S. for a variety of circumstances, not the least of which is that our labor force puts us in that solid position. Let's see. I'll have to do it that way. Real GDP update U.S. You had a weak first quarter, but you had a nice rebound in the second quarter. Overall, the pace of the U.S. economy is growing at about 2% a year, which is in a nice, modest, solid territory. For us in the state of Wisconsin, we had roughly the same situation. We had a weak first quarter, a nice rebound in the second quarter. In the far right of the column, there is a rather tall red bar compared to the blue bar, and that is, what is the contribution to GDP from manufacturing? We are outpacing the U.S. In some respects, if you were to follow that in close detail, while we're slightly below the U.S. in second quarter, a lot of that was just the drag that we've had in agriculture. For the private non-farm, we're actually outpaced the U.S. in the second quarter, and the reason we outpaced was because we had these gains in manufacturing. Now, twin deficit problem, as I characterize it, one of which is the federal budget deficit. Federal government spends about 36% more than it takes in. That's not sustainable on the long-term proposition. The other, which is we had a substantial deterioration in the U.S. balance of trade. Our exposure to any potential federal budget changes is relatively modest, because if you think in terms of particularly prospective federal employment changes, and there will be impact in Wisconsin, but because we have the lowest share of federal employment among all state economies, we will be less impacted relative to everywhere else. The concentration where you'll see those biggest impacts is, of course, in and around Washington, D.C., and Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia. It's not to say that we would be totally immune from it, because we have displayed here is where the counties in red have a higher share of federal employment for their total economy than the U.S. average. So you are exposed where we have big Veterans Affairs facilities or military facilities, or in the far north where we have national forest operations. Now, international trade, this is really where the flashpoint of the discussion is, because you had the situation of we've had a substantial deterioration in the U.S. trade deficit. I characterize this as my holy cat's graph. You've probably seen it before. What happened to the U.S. trade balance over the course of 4 years? It went up by a substantial $1 trillion. We cannot sustain that, and even internationally, it's recognized that a trade deficit of that magnitude can no longer be sustained because it's excessively large. That disrupts international trade generally if you were to persist with it. The other thing that goes with it for us is foreign direct investment dropped after 2021. Whereas you were used to seeing particularly European investments invest in the United States, there was a substantial decline. Now, as a result, whether it's the tariffs or anything else like that, all of the negotiations, the trade policy objective comes down to reprioritize U.S. manufacturing, and it's to support domestic manufacturing, particularly in areas where if you lose the capacity, you would have a substantial weakness in U.S. competitiveness. We could probably point to steel and aluminum as being sort of the poster child of this effort. The second of which is you have to rebuild defense production. You cannot have a situation where defense production is reliant on foreign powers, particularly, shall we say, adversarial foreign powers, if you want to maintain a secure defense production capability. And third and finally, the lesson out of COVID was if you rely on sole source and those trade relationships are impacted, you will suffer a supply shock that you can't have. So you want to diversify manufacturing generally. That theme probably is more substantial as we go through the data than I think we realize. There is clearly a bipartisan approach, and certainly manufacturers themselves recognize that third point is what we have to address. If that's the purpose, what are the objectives? First of all, you would level the playing field for trade. Number two of which is you want to bring manufacturing that was overseas back to the United States. You want to also build up what I call inshore manufacturing, build up foreign direct investment in the United States. And then finally, if we have domestic manufacturers, you want to encourage them to stay home. Those color codes become important when we get into Wisconsin manufacturing investment later on in the presentation. All right, quick view of our international trade. We had a surge in exports, but we've had this big trade deficit that's evolved largely because of trade imbalance with China, and number two, Ireland, as I'll illustrate later. Overall, our exports have not suffered all that much. It's been basically flat since September 2024. So if there were any retaliatory actions, we haven't seen it yet. We're running at about 1.5% year over year fairly consistently. While I say June, it's actually September 25. Actually, I'm going to take that back. It's September 24. One of the principal dynamics that I am impressed with for Wisconsin manufacturing is that if you think of our traditional lines of, well, we are a big machinery exporter, we export electrical equipment. No, there's a dynamic that is now involved in the Wisconsin economy. We are moving into areas that you would not necessarily associate with Wisconsin if you understood it from 10 years ago. One of which is we're getting big surges in our ability to export computer equipment, which a lot of industrial production is really expanding in computer equipment. The other of which is we compete in segments of the aerospace industry. We're suppliers to aerospace generally, including rocket launching, if we want to get into that, so that we are actually diversifying into big, high demand areas. Now, this is my reference to the Ireland trade deficit. Notice where our biggest source of imports from Ireland are pharmaceuticals. The U.S. pharmaceutical industry basically stopped producing in the U.S., moved particularly vaccines to Ireland with the intent of re-importing them into the United States. And one of the centers for the re-imports is the state of Wisconsin. That becomes important later. Now, for all the thunder about the tariffs and all the discussion, I think we need to address a certain set of questions, one of which is, well, will they work to improve the overall trade balance? The evidence is early, and the evidence is what I would characterize as modest. Clearly, compared to that big drop-off, we've had this regain. I think some of that big drop-off was just a surge in imports to offset anticipated tariffs, which would be wise enough. But year over year, we're looking at about almost $12 billion improvement in the balance of trade over the course of the past year. Really, that's the strongest we've had in the last 5 years. So in terms of improving balance of trade, so far, I would say what I would characterize as a B minus. That is to say, it's working, but you have to give it much more time than it has. This one I've titled Resolving the Twin Deficits. We have to understand that a tariff is nothing more than a tax on a commodity. It's the equivalent of an excise tax or a sales tax, or what I call a backdoor VAT tax, value-added tax. Lo and behold, displayed here in that green line moving sharply northward is the customs duties collected by the U.S. Treasury. The custom duties have risen by about 300 or 400 billion compared to almost nothing before that. As a result, one of the subtle properties that I don't know whether it was by design or good fortune on the part of the administration, the overall increase in tariffs has the property of reducing the budget deficit, including over a 10-year period. The Congressional Budget Office now suggests that the combined effect of the additional revenues plus lower interest payments, because the federal deficit itself goes down, you would be able to lower the estimated federal deficit by $4 trillion over 10 years. That's the Congressional Budget Office math. They multiply everything by 10. We have to understand that on an annual basis, it's about $400 billion, which doesn't close enough to resolve it, but it's a nice place to start. All right, let's go to inflation because that's relevant to the tariff discussion as well. Overall, consumer prices were up about 3% year over year. That is down slightly from the beginning of the year. And the prices vary widely. Some of our biggest price pressures now are in the service sector, particularly motor vehicle repair, home health care, elderly type care is where you're seeing the biggest price pressures. What usually drives the discussion on price pressure is housing. Housing costs are what dominate the consumer price index. The price of housing as a service is 35% of the total. If we think of the impact of tariffs on commodities, that's only about 20% of consumer spending if it applied to everything, which it doesn't. So don't quite have the leverage to move the needle all that substantially. If we back out volatility, consumers' prices are running about 3% CPI. So will tariffs be inflationary? My answer is not necessarily. Inflation is the general price rise. It's the average of hundreds of thousands of services and goods conventionally measured as a year-over-year increase. Tariffs won't necessarily increase inflation substantially, largely because, number one, the weight isn't there. While it's irritating at the grocery store and everything else like that, the biggest driver is housing costs. The second reason is offsets. Yes, you will get, and as I will show you, the offset in particular is, for example, yes, the price of coffee, to my everlasting irritation, went up 20%, but the price of gasoline went down 25 cents a gallon. I'm actually probably spending less overall because I'm getting gains on price reductions elsewhere to offset where I'm getting the increases. Import prices themselves are relatively flat. They've actually decelerated. There is a critical distinction that I need to make here, and that is this is the price of the imported good free on board. That is to say, as it leaves its port to head into the United States, that import price has not changed. Where we see the change is at a different level, which I'll illustrate shortly, on the producer price index, because the tariff, of course, is not imposed until the commodity arrives in the United States. Now, this is where my point is on weight. The overall weight in terms of commodities, excluding food and energy, is only 20%. That's the biggest possible impact. Where you get the biggest change in the consumer price index and among the bigger weights overall is, of course, housing. Now, the largest consumer price pressures are in the service sector. That is totally domestically sourced. It's probably related more to labor shortages among particular aspects than anything else. Where we get internationally sourced materials, think particularly as I've noted on the far right, smartphones and electronics, many of those, if they cannot be produced anywhere within the United States, they are totally exempt from tariffs to begin with. So that's the variety of things are fewer in number than you think. Tariffs do have an impact on certain prices, but not necessarily in the overall price index. Illustrated here is the producer price index. The producer price index has actually slowed down over the course of the year, even though, as highlighted in the red, we've put in 25 and 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum. Those are where we're seeing those big items go up. But the next one over is petroleum, crude petroleum is falling. That has a far bigger weight than the other products. So the overall price level isn't going up all that substantially. In particular, you have selected commodities that are going up, but you're getting declines elsewhere that offset it. Overall import prices decreasing modestly. Petroleum is what's keeping it down. All right. I'm going to go there and I'm going to switch to Wisconsin entrepreneurship. The number of businesses operating in the state of Wisconsin has grown sharply over the last several years, particularly first quarter 2025. I mean, if we look at sort of the last 4 years, we've gained more businesses operating in the ground in the last 4 years than we did in the prior 20 years in total. And its impact is pervasive. Almost every county is showing big increases. Particularly, my personal favorite is in the southeast corner. We're seeing Kenosha, Walworth County, and in the northwest, Eau Claire, Chippewa, Dunn, and St. Croix County, proving to me the number one. I've often joked, I think the strongest economic development tool the state of Wisconsin has is the state of Illinois. And I think the state of Minnesota is now starting to give Illinois some competition. All right, our labor markets. By the establishment survey, we've gained 23,000 jobs, August 25 over August 24. Our unemployment rate is at 3.1%. We've actually declined over the course of the year. The state of Minnesota, for example, has actually gone the other way. They've actually been increasing over the year. U.S. has been increasing over the year. We have the 8th lowest unemployment rate in the country. And the good news is for us, if we have low unemployment rate, that tends to attract talent to move into the state and talent to stay put. When job opportunities are there, residents do not feel compelled to leave the state to find another job. Non-residents are actually encouraged to move in. There's sort of a break-even point. If we can maintain an unemployment rate of about 4.2%, we do get in-migration into the state. Overall, by second week of September, our unemployment rate was at a 25, our unemployment insurance claims were at a 25-year low and falling. That's not a given. Any state in red you see here over that same time period saw an increase in their unemployment compensation claims compared to the year before. Now, our labor force, Wisconsin workers are more engaged than the U.S. average, and it's true by gender or ethnicity. And it's true for every age group. What I want to note in particular is the two youngest age groups. We have a big gap, positive gap, between us and the rest of the country in terms of engaging labor force at a younger age. Our youth are more likely to be engaged in the labor force early. I think that sets up, to be optimistic, a lifetime habit. Among prime working age population, we have the 7th highest labor force participation rate in the country. For the youngest group, 16 to 24, we have the 2nd highest labor force participation rate in the country. California can't hit 50% over that age group. We hit almost 75%. If we expand the definition of prime working age to include basically recent high school graduates, so it's from the 20 to 54, our labor force participation rate is the 4th highest in the country. If we had to show you the impact of that on the Wisconsin economy and why it becomes more competitive, that means that we have about 225,000 more people in the labor force than if we had the US average in terms of labor force participation. Because we are more engaged, we have more workers. Oops, I messed up. I gotta go back. How do I undo what I just did? Let's just try this. There we go. That sets up this thing. If we think in terms of the future is our younger labor force, let's even take it back a little stronger. Are we preparing children to enter the workforce for sort of, shall we say, skill readiness? Our eighth grade scores are about 10th in the country. That's, as I'll illustrate, there's a good news and bad news in it. The good news is we are competitive relative to the rest of the country in terms of eighth grade reading scores. The bad news is the COVID learning loss was substantial and we're still sort of coping with it. We're back to generational low, back to levels we saw in early 2000. Our mathematics scores are second highest in the country for eighth grade preparedness. And while the US is continuing to fall, we're starting to see a bounce back in terms of mathematics readiness. If there is another phenomenon that I think is relevant to manufacturing, one of the things that's happening is there are fewer people deciding to go on to college, and they are deciding now to go into the workforce immediately after high school. That is particularly true among men. So as we think in terms of doing the outreach for manufacturing, employment preparedness, and apprenticeships, I think there are stronger opportunities now than you would have seen 10 years ago. Now let's talk US manufacturing. There's my pitch right there. Production is increasing, productivity is increasing, the employment is relatively flat, but that's because productivity is increasing. Orders are increasing, shipments are increasing, sales and income increasing, and in particular, the United States is reinvesting in plant and equipment and manufacturing in ways that we haven't seen this century. Industrial production is actually up 1.8% September over September. But the big change for us is that is a reversal of what we were seeing the 2 prior years, where we were seeing month after month of decreases compared to prior year, and that was sustained from sort of late 2022 all the way into the end of 2024. Right now, we are looking at 10 consecutive months of industrial production increases over the prior year. The way we've actually been able to sustain the production is we're getting increases in labor productivity. You achieve labor productivity by basically increasing investment in plant and equipment and all the things that it implies. Overall employment is relatively flat, but we're getting big gains in productivity. Overall, US manufacturing payrolls are sort of bouncing back and forth, slightly ahead on the year. This is from the ADP Private Employment Report. As of August year to date, we were up about 31,000. It's as if we sort of do a 2 steps forward, 1 steps back in terms of manufacturing employment. Overall, job openings and hiring are slightly below 2019 levels for manufacturing at this stage. In terms of production, I did highlight that the overall industrial production index is increasing. There is a strong divide in manufacturing. Durable good manufacturing in particular is going strong, particularly in computer and electronics and now aerospace products. Almost all durable goods industries are seeing increases, and particularly, for example, coming back on primary metals. Non-durable goods industries, the production is only up slightly, largely driven by textiles and chemicals, whereas we're starting to see some of the big changes. Some of that is actually pharmaceuticals being brought back to the United States. Total manufacturing orders have, if you can see that lovely pattern, we went up to this level and basically stayed flat for about 2.5 years. We're now starting to see some really good growth in new orders. Year to date, we're up at about 3.5%. Consistent with all of that, sales are starting to increase. Net increase is up as well in manufacturing. In terms of durable goods orders, we're getting, again, while we sort of saw it in production, we're now seeing across the board in terms of orders. Durable goods orders are rising year to date through September across the board in all sectors for durable goods industries, particularly led by transportation, but computers and electronics and electrical equipment as well. In terms of the one size does not fit all, we now have a shift on primary metals. That would have been red largely a year ago. It isn't. It's now flipped the other way. Particularly good news for us is we're starting to see solid gains in orders for foundries. And Wisconsin is one of the primary foundry states is the primary foundry state in the country in terms of location quotient. Foundry orders are now at basically a 21st century high. Machinery values, the one to pay close attention to is we're seeing big orders on all of it, but the big shift is the gains that we're seeing in industrial equipment. That would be consistent with a strategy of in order to increase production in a particularly competitive labor market, automating is probably the most efficient strategy. Now, I already talked about tariffs in terms of its impact. One of the poster childs for tariffs is what happened in iron and what happened in steel. What are their orders like after we've basically imposed the tariffs? The vertical line is roughly the date and when the new tariffs for the 25 and then 50% tariffs on iron and steel and aluminum products were imposed. We are seeing a modest lift, I think, on the iron and steel orders, 3-month moving average, but we're seeing some big changes on the aluminum side. So at least on that side, I'm seeing much stronger results in terms of if you wanted to inspire domestic production, maybe you're getting that. Now back to new orders for computers and electronics. Basically, if defensive navigation is the only area it's down, but computers, in particular communications, went way up. Transportation, it's the big change in aircraft orders is such that I actually had to cut it off because it overwhelms it. Aircraft orders are up 120%. So if you're a supplier to the aircraft industry, as I highlighted that some of our exports are, we're in a solid position as well. Non-durable goods shipments are showing mixed results. Because it's dollar denominated, the petroleum one is down, but basically food products are up slightly. But overall, plastic and rubber down slightly, apparel down slightly, but overall, it's down a tad. For us in the paper industry, it's probably no surprise, particularly as we start seeing all those packages arrive on our porch door. Paper containers are doing really well, even if pulp isn't. On the chemical side, paints are down, but ag chemicals, and in particular, pharmaceuticals are way up compared to a year ago. If there is, as I pull it out, a theme that is, I think, relevant for us and any manufacturing center going forward, is the change in manufacturing investment itself. We are now, as a country and in the state of Wisconsin, reinvesting in manufacturing. Adjusted for inflation, you see this divide between construction spending. On the left side, it's private non-residential structures. That's more or less recovered. Residential structures flip the other way. It's down and really hasn't moved forward all that much. But if we look at the non-residential side, it's all in manufacturing structures. Non-residential structures, shall we say, commercial property, office space, is flat to declining, whereas we've seen this big surge in manufacturing structures. USA manufacturing investment is up significantly, reversing a trend that we saw in the early 2000s. There's the surge in just the physical plant, as I said. It's also, along with it, the surge in industrial equipment, which was relevant to those industrial orders that I mentioned back a ways, and will become more important for us later on. If we think in terms, I'm going to go back 1 second. It's startling to me to see how flat U.S. manufacturing investment was basically from early 2000 all the way up to probably 2021, and how it has taken off since then. Even adjusting for inflation, the surge that you saw in that spending, no, it's up there in real terms. Basically, while you saw almost no meaningful increase in investment in manufacturing structures for 20 years, you saw it take off, and we're now seeing when you build a new plant, you got to staff the equipment in it. That's following as well. Not a Wisconsin manufacturing. Overall, we're ninth in the country in terms of total manufacturing employment. There is a dynamic, and in terms of manufacturing intensity, we're the second in the country. These are sort of the basic facts that is worth repeating, but an audience well versed in manufacturing, you already knew this. I'm just reminding you of it. If there is, though, a phenomenon, I've already highlighted there is the investment in manufacturing in the United States. There is it is not shared. In particular, what you illustrated here is what I call the rebound in manufacturing. If you take 2010, that was the low point for manufacturing employment in this century. So over the last 25 years, 2010 was our low point. The question is, what happened after that? Well, any state in the dark green added more than 30,000 manufacturing jobs. Any state in yellow or red actually is continuing to lose manufacturing jobs. This is part and parcel of what I characterize as the deindustrialization of the Northeast. And if you really want to play with it, realize that since 2010, Wisconsin added twice as many jobs as the state of California has, for example, and the state of Illinois. So if you want to add New York, Illinois, California, we're way ahead of all three. For us as regions, taking that same exercise, you can see that there are pockets where we lost manufacturing jobs substantially, particularly in Milwaukee County. And at the time this was done, Winnebago County, that would be Oshkosh Truck. But there's this sort of nice flow of US 151 to Green Bay, I-41 north from the Kenosha to Green Bay, and then Highway 29 from Green Bay to St. Croix County. In particular, it's sort of impressive to me to see the gains that we're getting in north central Wisconsin across the board, whether we go northeast, north central, and to northwest. Overall, over the last 12 months, our manufacturing employment in total is roughly stable. We've had some losses in durable manufacturing, but they've been offset by gains on the non-durable side. This is part and parcel of what I was alluding to in the deindustrialization of the Northeast. There is a substantial variance for the increase in manufacturing value put in place by region. If you can recall, basically that map I showed you were the US, where we were adding manufacturing jobs and where we're not. Well, where we weren't, we're not putting any more manufacturing investment in it. It's in those regions that were in the dark green, and that includes the state of Wisconsin among the east, north, central states. Over the past 3 years, just in physical plant, not equipment because we don't tax it, we added $2.4 billion worth of real property investment in the state of Wisconsin. I mean, if you were to compare what we saw in the low, roughly 2010, we're running 6x, 10x on an annualized basis compared to what we were seeing back in those days. And we haven't seen anything yet. We have at this stage about $7 billion in manufacturing investment in the pipeline, and the news is actually continuing to get even better. This is again color coded when I basically said if you had your industrial strategy, you want foreign direct investment in the United States, you want to bring manufacturing back in the United States, that's the reshoring, and you want to stay home. Observe all of these cases are following that color code. We have about $2 billion worth of foreign direct investment in the state of Wisconsin. In terms of reshoring, Eli Lilly has moved to expand, acquire the import site for the pharmaceuticals, and then to build out new manufacturing facilities for pharmaceuticals as Eli Lilly brings all of the pharmaceutical capacity, or not all of it, but some of it, back into the United States. And they highlight, as quote in red, that we are a critical geography. And let me back up one more on the foreign direct investment. Do we remember Foxconn? They just 2 weeks ago announced that, yeah, we're going to add another almost $600 million in an expansion of Mount Pleasant. So they are, again, following the trend on the foreign direct investment. If I go top to bottom, it was Japan, Switzerland, Japan, Germany, China, or say ABB's, I did take the paper one up, China, Japan, and Taiwan. Now, in the stay-at-home side, the one in particularly I want to emphasize is on the bottom, and Rockwell International, primary manufacturer of industrial equipment, decides that now we're going to expand in the United States and we're going to put 2 billion in the United States, and it's going to be in Ohio and Wisconsin. Hey, exactly where I suggested the action is in eastern or central states. The estimated facility for the state of Wisconsin will be their biggest facility ever, and they operate in multiple countries. All right, I have to talk about this because it's also relevant to some of these discussions as we do the build out. Uh, the major investment in data centers in the state of Wisconsin is rather startling. The state of Wisconsin at this stage has on the books about $20 billion worth of investment planned in data centers as highlighted. You'll build it here because it's cheaper to build here. Electricity is less expensive here. But as we go through the list, Microsoft has now upped their investment to about 7.3 trillion. Unidentified developer is also developing in town of Paris, Kenosha County. That center is supplied by Wisconsin Electric LLC. Cloverleaf Infrastructure in Port Washington basically support an OpenAI, Oracle Advantage, is now scheduled to put in $15 billion worth of investment. Phase one by itself is $8 billion. Meta in Beaver Dam is dropping $1 billion on their first phase to build out there on a 520-acre campus. QTS Data Center starts with about 3 to 5 buildings, planning even to go about up to 15, and each building is about 300 million. And I would love to be debriefed from everybody in the audience here as what's going on with the planned data center in Dunn County. That was scheduled, but I believe under current resistance, it's set on hold pending further development, but presumably there is potential to put another one in the Northwest Wisconsin. One of the impact on the data centers will, of course, impact industrial electricity rates. Some of the data centers are actually planning to produce enough energy in-house that they would return some of it to the grid. Details pending, of course. All of this is relevant because as we've been planning to take facilities offline, you do get pressure on the electricity grid because at the same time you're ramping up the demand for electricity because of data centers and, if we think about it, investment in industrial plant and equipment, we are actually scheduling to take certain plants offline. Not the least of which is highlighted here is about 15% of our overall electricity is generated at Point Beach Nuclear Power Plant. That is 24/7 baseload power with over 95% reliability. It was scheduled for decommission within 5 years. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission had suspended the application for extension back in 2022. The new administration decided, no, we're going to restart the approval process and review process April 25 with the promise that they would get a decision sometime this month. So let's watch this space. If I could get a sports book bet on that, I would bet the yes. So we'll see what happens. There is, as a result of all of the investment on the industrial and the data center side, big investments coming forward on electricity as well. As I highlighted, we're scheduled to take certain coal plants offline. Now we have both the current pipeline. Wisconsin Energy is adding about 5.5 billion in project. North States Power is about 700 more projects. Public Service Commission has 15 projects under review, at least 6 of which are solar, and 4 of those with the battery as backup as well. In terms of future prospects, by a bipartisan vote, and signature by Governor Evers, Acts 12 and 11 basically lean into if we're going to build out capacity. Department of Energy has said you have at least 2 sites that would be suitable to put in small modular reactors going forward. The legislation requires the PSC to determine which 2 sites are going to be appropriate for that location. That's an expedited review at that stage. And highlighted in red, the owner of the Kewanee Nuclear Power Plant is now doing the evaluation of how to reopen the power plant to add more power to the grid. All right, tax competitiveness. You don't expect to hear somebody from the Department of Revenue talk without mentioning this subject. So Wisconsin state and local tax burden is already the lowest it's been in 40 years, below average overall, significant reduction in our income tax burden, but most important is our business tax climate competitiveness. This is from the study published a year ago by the Council on State Taxation. Basically, they do let's add all business taxes together, divide by private sector GDP. That's the effective business tax rate. That puts us in the lower quartile, way below the state of Illinois, below the state of Minnesota, suggesting that relative, particularly some of these decisions we're seeing on these plants coming into the state of Wisconsin or the data centers, this isn't part and parcel. Part of it is we offer a better tax environment as well. And of course, we removed business personal property from the tax a year ago. That was sufficient to drop our property tax ranking by about 5 slots. We're not done yet. There's more tax cuts in the pipeline with an income tax reduction for a retirement income exclusion and an expansion of the second bracket, which is to say we'll take a lower income tax bracket and we will raise the income ceiling so less of the higher income is subject to the higher rates. Basically, the middle bracket is getting wider. The other of which is residential electricity is now exempt from the sales tax outright. All right. Outlook. Yield curve is suggesting the overall outlook is actually improving. You have a strong divide now between the 3-month Treasury and the 10-year Treasury. Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland and New York track the difference in basis points for estimating what is the risk of recession. If you have a positive slope to the yield curve, and that's the red line, that is actually indicative of a stronger economy, basically expanding economy. As a matter of the overall risk of recession as a consequence, as the Federal Reserve has dropped short-term interest rates, the risk has now fallen where it was about 50% or stronger a year ago. It's now down to the stage of it's 25% and falling. I'll be waiting for tomorrow's can't update this one for 2 days because I'm a little ahead. But the Federal Reserve basically thought in terms of real GDP was going to grow about 1.8% in 26 and 27. I wouldn't be shocked to see that raised. They also signaled that by the end of 2025, that is to say their next meeting this week, the federal funds rate they expected to be about 3.6, which would imply that you will get a 25 basis point reduction on the federal funds rate. But then it gets more modest, and they will take one more shot at it sometime in 2026 and one after that in 2027. For us, we're looking at steady growth through 2027 in the 2% territory, very consistent with what is the Federal Reserve's outlook as well. Our unemployment rate will stay below 4%. And actually, I think for first rule of forecast is look out the window. We're actually performing better than we had originally forecast on the unemployment rate side. We expect continued expansion in the establishment survey, the employer survey for employment, roughly consistent with what we saw. It's in the mid-teens to 20s going forward, but continuing to add on. All right. With that, I'm going to wrap up, and I will be open to any questions.
John, it's Buckley. Where
Yeah.
are you if you're looking for something that we should be focusing on in order to see where there might be a problem? Where are you looking right now?
Oh, I think the biggest problem you have is whether or not you're going to continue to get the labor force. I think that's why manufacturers are clearly leading into we're going to automate. It's startling sometimes. I had the distinct pleasure of speaking at a local manufacturer, built a brand new facility, and the emphasis where they said, we have gone robotics and reduced headcount. That becomes the overall strategy. If I were to lean into one thing in particular, the biggest, or you get me talking and I can start getting the better to your answer. The competition that manufacturers will have for workforce, particularly among young folks entering the labor force, is the trades. Construction is going to be a huge competitor. If you think of blue collar as sort of one group, construction pays better and is going to be hiring more aggressively. I don't, you can sort of even my watching the Packer broadcast and seeing how Michaels is advertising, come work for us, right? And in the Brewers broadcast in Liuna, um, construction workers, you're going to be competing for that same labor pool. Does that make sense? And you might see the same thing.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. That's what we're seeing in our data as well. One other quick question for you. In the what do you how transitory do you think the investments in data centers are right now? We're seeing a bump in construction, we're seeing a bump in employment around there, but once they're in place, how strong do you see this going into the future?
It's I had the good fortune of speaking to the Beaver Dam Chamber of Commerce, and the person that followed me was the Midwest government relations spokesman for Meta out of Iowa, right? And the general challenge with data centers is they're huge, but the employment base isn't a lot because it's so automated, right? But the question becomes, once they have Meta in particular, I was surprised. Once they have the site and once they start developing the workforce, they're going to build another one. And you can see that point blank with the Beaver Dam. So, whether it's transitory, we build it and we walk away and there are no jobs there. I don't think that's going to be the experience of it. You may well, obviously the multiple on construction employment over the first 3 years while you're building it out compared to the staff on the ground that's a permanent basis. Yeah, that's big, but the permanent basis doesn't walk away so long as the data center is there. And, I don't know that a data center is going to be plug and play for all that, especially when you started part of the discussion that I didn't realize. I thought of it just sort of, okay, it's stores the data like I'm used to. Um, and yes, artificial intelligence is going to boost the demand for searches and all this stuff. No, with Meta in particular on Facebook, it's every Facebook exchange, it's every textbook exchange, it's all the video, it's 4K video, and it's stored forever. That's not going away. You're probably going to improve the density of what you can retrieve because of the nature of it. But to realize you have that access worldwide 24/7, that's an undertaking. So that was a long answer, but
Hi, quick question. This is Kathy Henrich. One is when you look at if you were building a strategic plan for the future and looked at those sub-industries that are having the most economic impact, like you mentioned, the growth of aerospace, et cetera,
Right.
and you look at the multiplier effects, what would be kind of the sub-industries that you would want to grow here in Wisconsin?
I'll tell you the one that is really was not on my radar until I had to address WMEP a year or so ago. The quote unquote chemical industry, I tend to think of it for Wisconsin as ag chemicals and waxes and polishes, right? It's the pharmaceutical industry. That, Abbott Labs buys, I think it was Exact Sciences. We've been building it from scratch, and then to realize that we're going to build it out in full tilt in Kenosha. Anything related to that, I think, is where that's coming through. In terms of suppliers to other industries, I mean, I have, since I go out on the road so much, and it's questions like this that get me thinking, which is why I appreciate it. I am surprised to see suppliers to the aerospace industry in Kewaunee County. I mean, there are a variety of those components that go into it. But it's, and it's Portage, it's Kenosha, it's Milwaukee, because putting a airplane into the air and not fall out of the sky requires lots and lots of contributors. I could be educated here, I could need some feedback, but as you worry about some of the exports, if we're exporting computers, I suspect it tends to be more out of the Hewlett Packard Enterprises out of Chippewa Falls, right? I think so. Um, if you know, so long as and those orders nationally are just going guns and great guns, and that's sort of if you can be a supplier to a data center, that would be great, right? You know, they have.
Yeah, second question for you, and I'll just preface this by saying earlier today I was on a global webcast with a board for boards and CEOs,
Right.
and it was an international meeting, and their view of the long-term prospects of the United States is not positive at all. And part of that was due to our debt load that we have relative to GDP. And I didn't see that come into your analysis. So my question is, how might the debt load play into all of this?
Boy, I'm gonna give me a second to compose the answer before I go off on a really long riff. Where I think the debt load of the United States in total, that is to say, the debt load of businesses plus households plus government is not growing faster than GDP. And that's easily overlooked. The overall borrowing on the part of households has been shrinking continuously since the housing crisis. So if households aren't borrowing as much money because lending standards are tight, among other things, and businesses are basically going to use cash financing or equity financing, right? Those groups aren't borrowing the money. It's all on the federal side. And so in terms of, gosh, that risk to me is twofold. One of which is if the federal government, I didn't do my federal government slides in depth because I realized it was time limited. The federal government borrows so much money, the overall share of the amount it takes to service the debt goes up. We spend more money on interest at the federal level now than we do on grants to state and local government or the national defense. That's not a sustainable proposition. You do have to shrink the debt. Just from a federal budget standpoint, this is somebody who comes from a background in state budgeting. From a macroeconomic condition, I don't think it's an issue because of the two offsets I just mentioned. The rest of the share of debt for consumers and businesses is declining. So the total indebtedness in the United States doesn't move much. But in terms of your ability to respond to crises because of federal debt, we're probably already maxed out. There is, I would say, to the overall strategy, which is if you have faster growth, and you can basically hold the line on the federal budget, the debt starts decreasing. It's not impossible to have a federal budget surplus because we started the century with one. Whether or not you have the political consensus to do it is interesting, but I think there is recognized and there's pressure to do it. Now, there was another point that I wanted to make on the federal debt. So I am, shall we say, less cynical about it because it's easily masked the other way. The big effect to me is the crowding out of other things just because you have to spend money on the interest. I'm going to have to. I wish you had asked me that. I should have asked for a question to begin with. If you had asked me that at the top, so I could probably go find the slide someplace. It's in this computer someplace.
Thank you.
Oh, wait a minute. That was the other point that I wanted to make on the debt. The U.S. government debt is about 74% held by domestic citizens. 26% isn't. Of those foreign holdings, most of it is Japan. And of all things, there was somebody else had raised the concern, well, China holds the debt, and what happens if they sell it all? Well, China's actually been decreasing its holdings of U.S. government debt gradually. They sort of let the debt expire and just don't go back and buy it new. So the combined total of U.S. government debt held in Belgium and Luxembourg exceeds the amount held by China. And number 4 in holdings for U.S. government debt is the Cayman Islands, suggesting a lot of well-to-do individuals have decided to hang on to that debt. And matter of fact, the holdings by the Cayman Islands is like 4th overall. So compared to other European countries in particular, not even on the list. All right. That was the point that I was trying to recall.
All right. And if there aren't any other questions, we will be sending out a follow-up email after this. And if you have any other questions, you can let us know and we'll get you in touch with John for any of those. We do have our January 2026 webinar is open for registration. We'll send out that link too in the follow-up email so you can see what's coming up for 2026 and get signed up for some of those. I think with that, I think we'll say thank you to John for his time today. And we appreciate everybody for logging on and spending some time with us today.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.